Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and today I want to talk about Breath of the Wild 2 and the presence of Ganon in it. But more specifically, I want to focus on a bit of discussion surrounding this idea that this time around, the incarnation of Ganon, or Ganondorf, is going to be the strongest yet. And this is an exciting premise because I feel like it adds to the stakes and the mystique around the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. I think there's some exciting possibilities here, and based off some things we've seen, I do think there's actually a pretty decent likelihood that we are looking at the very strongest Ganon yet in Breath of the Wild 2. So that's what we're talking about today. But before we jump into things, let me very briefly mention my social media. You can check that all out. It is linked in the description below. And also, you could leave a like, it's greatly appreciated, or perhaps subscribe if you haven't done so already, or maybe even join as a member. But let's now jump into things. So, why is it that people think, myself included, that this is going to be the strongest iteration of Ganon yet? And the biggest reason is because, well, this is the newest Legend of Zelda. This is potentially going to be the largest Legend of Zelda yet, and we're seeing a focus on this character, more so than the previous game. So let's talk about that for a moment here. In Breath of the Wild, there was Calamity Ganon. The idea behind Calamity Ganon is that after generations of failing to take over Hyrule and beat Link and Zelda, or whatever their reincarnations were at that time, he has given up on a physical form, i.e. Ganondorf, and has now just become this force of nature known as Calamity Ganon. And the concluding events of Breath of the Wild would lead one to believe that Calamity Ganon is no more. But with the initial trailer, the initial teaser for Breath of the Wild 2, an entirely different angle is presented. And the angle that's presented is that there is malice coming from a particular source under Hyrule Castle. And this source is this corpse that appears to be Ganondorf. So firstly, I'm not going to argue why this is Ganondorf. Many people believe it's Ganondorf. There's a number of mounting evidence here. But I think the most important thing to consider is that not only is this Ganondorf an incarnation of Ganondorf, this is the incarnation of Ganondorf. Technically, in terms of lore and what's been confirmed, there have only been 2 incarnations of Ganondorf throughout the entire Zelda series. Now, you may question that and wonder, how can that be? Ganondorf has been in so many different games. Well, he's usually just in the 3D Zelda games. However, he had one incarnation in one of the Four Swords games, even though the initial incarnation of Ganondorf, his spirit was present there as well. In all the other games where Ganondorf is there, it's the same Ganondorf, just in a different timeline. Sometimes the timeline splits, sometimes the timeline simply progresses forward, and he finds a way to survive, to persist. I think a lot of that comes down to the Triforce of Power. When we take a look at Twilight Princess, he was chained. He was going to be executed. Yet the Triforce of Power granted him the power to break free. And I think this was the source of his strength, at least in part. But as we see throughout the different games, specifically I want to focus on Twilight Princess here, Ganondorf starts to exhibit different abilities that are reminiscent of what we see in Breath of the Wild. We see references to malice. We see this spiritual gaseous form in Twilight Princess that is not too far off from what we see with Calamity Ganon. And then of course, Ganondorf is defeated in Twilight Princess with a hole in his torso, chest area, his sternum area, and that's not too far off from the hole we see from the corpse of Ganondorf. And yet we see malice emanating from this. So there seems to be a connection here, but I think the biggest point to be made here is that from what we understand of Breath of the Wild, the initial events of the Calamity happened over 10,000 years ago. So there's been generations upon generations where there hasn't been a specific Ganondorf, but the implication here is that the main Ganondorf that has persisted and been the main enemy in most of the 3D Zelda games is still here, and it is the source of all of the Calamity, because we see the malice emanating from it. And the other implication here is it's under Hyrule Castle, because that's where we see the Calamity break out from in Breath of the Wild. That's up for debate, But the main point here is that Ganondorf has persisted somehow as a corpse, and his hatred has turned into its own antagonist, its own force of nature in Calamity Ganon. But the very source is still there, dormant. So if just his hatred, after thousands upon thousands of years of just sitting there, has mounted up and built up and become something that led to a post-apocalyptic or dystopian version of Hyrule, what happens when the source wakes up? After all this pent-up and built-up anger and presumably building up power over generations, we could be looking at the strongest Ganon yet. And I say Ganon because Ganon is more of a overall umbrella term for the different iterations of Ganon or Ganondorf. It's kind of like two different versions, right? Ganondorf is the man, and Ganon is like the overall entity when he became the Demon King, when he elevated his power from the Triforce. And on that note, there's another exciting premise here. So, what's fascinating is that we're seeing this character of Ganondorf, and we may have more of a rivalry between Link and Ganondorf this time around. We may see more of a personality, learn more about his history, as hinted at by the first trailer, because we do see that little flash with a silhouette showing him in a more whole, less decrepit form. So there could be sort of histories or flashbacks or scenes to that. But also, with every previous iteration of Ganondorf, we've seen the transformation into Ganon, that monstrous, powerful form. And we saw a form like that in Breath of the Wild, but as many of you know, or if you haven't, I'll tell you now, it's widely considered to be a little bit of a letdown, a bit of a victory lap, because it's not too much of a challenge. The giant pig beast just sort of sits there in the middle of Hyrule Field, you circle around, you shoot some goddess circles, and you call it a day. That's it. It's not really as climactic as previous forms, for example, his initial transformation in Ocarina of Time. But with Ganondorf himself coming back, that transformation into the actual Ganon, and not just a gaseous form that has sort of come from the little cracks of Hyrule, from the core of this malice, this hole in his chest or sternum area, could be a significant difference there. It's one thing to just have the little embers or little leftover pieces of malice or anger that's built up that become this gaseous form in Calamity Ganon, versus the very core, the very foundation of it all that's been building up anger and hatred and lasting for thousands of years. And considering that Breath of the Wild is the latest game in the timeline, we don't know exactly where it falls, we just know it's far after every single other game in the timeline, and with the sequel being just a little tiny bit further and showing the true form, the true core of Ganon and or Ganondorf, there's even more reason to think this is going to be the most wised up, the most experienced, the most powerful version of Ganon yet. And that's really exciting, and I think it really does add to the stakes for this game, and I can't wait till we get more information on it whenever that happens. But what do you guys think? What do you guys make of the potential of this iteration of Ganon and or Ganondorf? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, everyone, this is Andres Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.